goes there?
The Delapore Media Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Delapore Media Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Wall. This is a Lovecraftian commentary show where I bring you topics and literature that inspire my ttrpgs in writing so that you can be inspired in your own creative pursuits. I read cosmic horror works of today and yesterday, I talk about theory and history, I workshop ideas, and hopefully we all learn something along the way that makes us better, more informed creators of horror. If you like what you hear, please leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, as that's the best way to help the show grow and reach more listeners. In this episode, I'm going to look at 3 perspectives on witchcraft and consider how they relate to each other and to cosmic horror. I'll start with one of H.P. Lovecraft's favorite resources for horror inspiration, The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray. I'll then explore Newfoundland traditions of curses and witchcraft with Barbara Rieti's Making Witches, and I'll end on Sabina Magliocco's witching culture, as well as my own observations of the Neo-Pagan community of Los Angeles. Before we get started, though, some brief news. Rob Poyton and Tim Mendes of the Innsmouth Book Club and Strange Shadows podcasts have invited me to be a guest at the 2026 Innsmouth Literary Festival. I'm excited to visit Bedford later this year and be part of the convention's panel on suburban horror, along with authors Heather Miller and David Hambling. The convention takes place on Saturday, the 19th of September, at King's House in Bedford. And I intend to be there for a few days soaking up the atmosphere, checking out the hiking trails, and maybe running some ttrpgs. I might even have something new to playtest. But more on that another time. For now, let's talk about witchcraft. The first resource I want to address is The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray. Given the age of the book and that it's now over 100 years old, I think it's important that we talk about some context, because context can get forgotten with time. So let's examine Margaret Murray as a person. Fortunately, we have Sabina Magliocco's Witching Culture, which gives us a pretty good rundown of who Murray was and what she was all about, and seats her within her time period. So Margaret Murray was not an anthropologist, she was not a folklorist. She was in fact an Egyptologist. And the outbreak of the First World War puts an end to her studies in Egypt. So she's in this position where she can't do what she has trained to do. And when you do that to an academic of any kind, their mind just kind of starts spinning, and they start spinning their wheels. They start looking at what's immediately around them, and they start analyzing. And at the time, James Frazer's Golden Bough was still incredibly popular. It had come out maybe about 20 years prior, I want to say. But there were expanded editions, and his theory regarding a pre-Christian European religion, a fertility cult, was picking up steam. So Margaret Murray picked this up, and she started looking at James Frazer in terms of the witchcraft panics of the 16 and 1700s, and eventually even into the Salem witchcraft panics as well, not just Europe, but the New World. And so Murray examines figures like Cotton Mather, and she sees this two-sided debate taking place, even in her contemporary time. You know, on the one hand, you have kind of the religious far right of the day saying that witchcraft exists, it always has existed. There are devil worshippers hiding under rocks and under your stairs and that sort of thing. And then you have kind of the new psychology movement saying that, well, this was actually a case of mass hysteria. You might even have some early feminists suggesting that this is about the position of women in rural societies, and particularly looking at the colonial period and how there was so much that needed doing but so few people to do it that women were able to step up in new and different ways. And that ultimately challenged colonial patriarchy. And so Margaret Murray enters this debate and decides that, well, I can bring both sides together on this. I can pull in the people who are thinking that there are witches and warlocks hiding under rocks everywhere, and also the people who are seeing the witchcraft panic as, well, a panic, a moral panic, and an overreach of society that harmed people. And she does this through the lens of James Frazer. She effectively looks at the works of Cotton Mather and other religious figures involved in witch panics and witch hunts and deduces a kind of religion from what they're talking about. Because, people like Cotton Mather, despite the fact he was not a practitioner of witchcraft himself, he set himself up as an authority on witchcraft. Not involved in any way, of course, but very clear on how to diagnose and understand the enemy. Almost as though the enemy was something created in his imagination. But of course, we're not there yet. We're still taking him seriously in Margaret Murray's day, at least seriously to a degree. And so Murray reads Mather, and she reads other witchfinders, and she also reads James Frazer, and she starts to work backwards from the witch trials to synthesize a religion. And this makes sense for someone like Murray, who was an Egyptologist, and at that time, piecing together the Egyptian religion was kind of the core process. People weren't looking at the everyday life of Egyptians. They were looking at the tombs and sepulchres that were left behind, trying to pull together how the Egyptian conception of religion worked. And so she does the same thing with her witch cult. And Murray starts by establishing that there is a continuity of religion, that this witch cult was not just something that fell out of the sky or crawled out of the ground. It has traceable roots as far as Murray is concerned. Murray states that the witch cult of Cotton Mather's day is a survival of a pre-Christian Roman cult that worshipped gods such as Janus or Dianus or Diana in the feminine form. Put a pin in that. That'll be important later on. And that when witchfinders and inquisitors observed this cult and its practices, they labeled the worship taking place as the worship of the devil, the worship of Satan. What was particularly disturbing to these witchfinders was that these cultists could see their god as a living person or a living animal. The god of the cult was present and was in fact the leader of the cult. A human being or animal would embody the personhood of the god at the center of this religion. And that was particularly disturbing to Christian zealots, as their understanding was that God and Jesus were in heaven, and the only entity that could be roaming around the earth was the devil or one of his demons. Therefore, we get this image from Cotton Mather and other witchfinders of witches holding Sabbats where they offer themselves to the devil because the devil is present at the ritual. Murray contends what they don't understand is that the devil is actually a person within the cult, playing the god of the cult, assuming the role of the god of the cult. This is further confused by the fact that the god of the cult can assume the form of an animal in the cult's tradition. So the practitioners might go to their religious site and find an animal of some sort, a horse, a goat, a cat, and see it present at the site and understand that as the god of their cult being present in animal form. Among the various rituals of this cult, Murray contends some of the most important had to be the admission ceremonies. The ceremonies by which one is brought into the cult and made a member. a sort of demonic or satanic baptism from the perspective of outside inquisitors and witchfinders. Murray states that the ceremony involved a general introduction to the cult of a new adherent. That adherent would first renounce all previous religious associations. So in order to join the cult, you first have to say, I deny and renounce my previous involvement with Christianity, which of course is going to set the witchfinders off right away. The second thing that they have to do is make a new covenant with the god of the witch cult religion, which again Murray points out is a person holding the place of that deity, which the witchfinders interpret as the devil. And the third thing is that a mark is placed upon the new devotee. Such marked individuals are then permitted to participate in the regular rites of the cult. This includes paying homage to the god, falling to one's knees, and worshiping the god, which, again, is a person, is effectively the leader of the cult, according to Murray. There's also dancing and playing music before the god, feasting, and a sort of sacrament that, from the perspective of the witchfinders, apes or twists the Christian sacrament of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Further homage is paid to the god in the form of sacrifice. Murray contends that this might be a blood sacrifice from the adherent to the cult themselves. It could be an animal sacrifice, or it could be a sacrifice of a human being, even a sacrifice of the god. So that in Murray's vision, the leader of the cult might be sacrificed as a kind of divine victim to allow the cult to spread divinity amongst its members. And I don't know about you, but the snarky atheist in me kind of appreciates this, or at least appreciates Murray's naivety or the assumption of religious equity, in that up until this point we kind of have this leader figure of the cult who is getting all the benefits of the cult's offering and sacrifices. But then we turn around, and in Murray's vision of what this witch cult looks like, the god of the cult has to sacrifice himself for the cult members, which is very much a putting your money where your mouth is kind of experience that you don't see in most modern religions. And I have to say, it's a refreshing thought at the very least. Even though this is Murray's extrapolated fiction, it is nice to see at least that there is some equity going on here. So this naturally leads to the question, to what end? Why are people in Murray's mind pursuing this extrapolated religion? What benefit do they obtain by doing it? I mean, sure, it's nice to socialize in the woods with your friends and, maybe gather around the image of a deity and celebrate with a feast and some dancing and a bit of sacrament. I mean, who doesn't enjoy that? But why? And Murray lands on fertility. This is a rural cult with a relationship to cultivation of the land, cultivation of livestock. And so why these rites happen is because these cultists want to ensure fertility. And that bears out in the rites as well, as some of the rites paying homage to the god of the cult, acts of symbolic or ritualized copulation. So we've essentially got a bunch of people who are living off the land, living off the fruits of their crops and livestock, meeting in the woods to fuck each other in order to pass that ritual magic on to the plants and animals and families that are their livelihood. So we have what they're doing, and we have why they're doing it now. And further to this, Murray doesn't just suggest that this is a general practice. It isn't a matter of, we meet in the woods on particular nights, we worship somebody as our god, we fuck that person or fuck each other in the midst of this person in order to pass the power of magic on to what we're doing. We gain specific abilities by practicing these rituals. Murray points out in particular rainmaking is one of these capacities, one of these magic spells that is passed on through the process of worship. It's a gift that is gained. Murray also points out that gifts of familiars are given to cult members, or at least understood as signs of the god being pleased with cult members or the magic working. So cult members might have a particular animal, a wild animal, or a domestic animal that they understand to be their familiar. This animal can guide and direct their practice, as well as guard against hazards. Furthermore, there is a general belief amongst the cultists that because they practice these sacrificial and sex rites to the god of their cult, that they inherit the god's ability to transform into animals. For Murray's part, she chalks this up to a kind of religious hysteria, which again takes us back to her context of the first decades of the 20th century, where women in particular are understood to be vulnerable to fits of hysteria, and that these fits of hysteria often have to do with sex and sexuality. And so the fact that this is a cult of not just sacrifice, but also ritualized sexual practice leads, in Murray's mind, these women to believe that they can transform into animals. So we can obviously see everything that makes up a witch panic within Murray's conception of the witch cult. I mean, we have renunciation of Christianity, we have some sort of cloaked figure with magical powers participating in the rites, we have blood and animal sacrifices, we have human sacrifices, we have sex rites, which are always good for grabbing headlines. We have magical animals, and we have people who are either capable of magical acts themselves or are under the psychological misunderstanding through hysteria that they possess magical powers. So Murray isn't exactly giving us a new direction with her witch cult. She's sort of reinventing the wheel that Cotton Mather invented. She is looking at the witchfinder practices and the witchfinder writings, and she is saying, oh, well, there could be a religion here that has nothing to do with the devil. Maybe it's just a pagan survival. And along comes H.P. Lovecraft, who is, we know from letters, aware of Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe. It's even mentioned in some stories that he wrote. And further to that, we know he has a first edition copy of Magnalia Christi Americana, or the Ecclesiastical History of New England, written by Cotton Mather. According to Joshi and Schultz's book, Lovecraft's Library, this was actually a piece of family inheritance. So he's thoroughly familiar with the witchcraft panics of New England. And what's more, he's seeing Margaret Murray create this pre-Christian religion out of the data from the witchcraft panics. And he's saying to himself, well, if she can create a religion based on that, why can't I create a religion? And so Janus and Dianus are supplanted in favor of Lovecraft's creations, Nyarlathotep and Azathoth. And if we look at Lovecraft's most infamous dimension-hopping witch, Keziah Mason, it tracks. She's part of this group that gathers together in Arkham to make sacrifices on Walpurgisnacht. She attempts to initiate the young, naive mathematics student Walter Gilman, forcing him to witness and commit atrocities against children in order to sever his connection to traditional morality and his humanity. She brings him before an avatar of Nyarlathotep that stands in for the devil of Puritan witchfinder lore, or the cult leader embodying a Roman god, per Margaret Murray. Keziah has a familiar in the form of the rat thing Brown Jenkin. The creature clearly holds a great deal of affection for Nyarlathotep, and we could certainly see it as a divine gift to Keziah. As a reward for her service, the rat creature acts like a guide, allowing Keziah and Gilman to move between dimensions, and it aids Keziah as she attempts to force Gilman into performing an act of sacrifice or tribute to Nyarlathotep. From the Dreams in the Witch House by H.P. Lovecraft. Originally published in Weird Tales magazine, July 1933. On the morning of April 27th, a fresh rat hole appeared in the room where Gilman was a guest, but Dombrowski tinned it up during the day. The poison was not having much effect, for scratchings and scurryings in the wall were virtually undiminished. Elwood was out late that night, and Gilman waited up for him. He did not wish to go to sleep in a room alone, especially since he thought he had glimpsed in the evening twilight the repellent old woman whose image had become so horribly transferred to his dreams. He wondered who she was, and what had been near her rattling the tin can in a rubbish heap at the mouth of the squalid courtyard. The crone seemed to notice him and leer evilly at him, though perhaps this was merely his imagination. The next day both youths felt very tired, and knew they would sleep like logs when night came. In the evening they drowsily discussed the mathematical studies which had so completely and perhaps harmfully engrossed Gilman, and speculated about the linkage with ancient magic and folklore which seemed so darkly probable. They spoke of old Keziah Mason, and Elwood agreed that Gilman had good scientific grounds for thinking she might have stumbled on strange and significant information. The hidden cults to which these witches belonged often guarded and handed down surprising secrets from elder, forgotten aeons, and it was by no means impossible that Keziah had actually mastered the art of passing through dimensional gates. Tradition emphasizes the uselessness of material barriers in halting a witch's motions, and who can say what underlies the old tales of broomstick rides through the night? Whether a modern student could ever gain similar powers from mathematical research alone was still to be seen. Success, Gilman added, might lead to dangerous and unthinkable situations, for who could foretell the conditions pervading an adjacent but normally inaccessible dimension? On the other hand, the picturesque possibilities were enormous. Time could not exist in certain belts of space, and by entering and remaining in such a belt one might preserve one's life and age indefinitely, never suffering organic metabolism or deterioration, except for slight amounts incurred during visits to one's own or similar planes. One might, for example, pass into a timeless dimension and emerge at some remote period of the Earth's history as young as before. Whether anybody had ever managed to do this, one could hardly conjecture with any degree of authority. Old legends are hazy and ambiguous, and in historic times all attempts at crossing forbidden gaps seemed complicated by strange and terrible alliances with beings and messengers from outside. There was the immemorial figure of the deputy or messenger of the hidden and terrible powers, the black man of the witch cult, and the Nyarlathotep of the Necronomicon. There was, too, the baffling problem of the lesser messengers and intermediaries, the quasi-animals and queer hybrids which legend depicts as witches' familiars. As Gilman and Elwood retired, too sleepy to argue further, they heard Joe Mazurowitz reel into the house half-drunk and shuddered at the desperate wildness of his whining prayers. That night Gilman saw the violet light again. In his dream he had heard a scratching and gnawing at the partitions, and thought that someone fumbled clumsily with the latch. Then he saw the old woman and a small, furry thing advancing toward him over the carpeted floor. The beldame's face was alight with an inhuman exultation, and the little yellow-toothed morbidity tittered mockingly as it pointed at the heavily sleeping form of Elwood on the other couch across the room. A paralysis of fear stifled all attempts to cry out, as once before the hideous crone seized Gilman by the shoulders, yanking him out of bed and into empty space. Again the infinitude of shrieking twilight abysses flashed past him, but in another second he had thought he was in a dark, muddy, unknown alley of fetid odors, with the rotting walls of ancient houses towering up on every hand. Ahead was the robed black man he had seen in the peaked space in the other dream, while from a lesser distance the old woman was beckoning and grimacing imperiously. Brown Jenkin was rubbing itself with a kind of affectionate playfulness around the ankles of the black man, which the deep mud largely concealed. There was a dark open doorway to the right, to which the black man silently pointed. Into this the grimacing crone started, dragging Gilman after her by his pajama sleeve. There were evil-smelling staircases which creaked ominously, and on which the old woman seemed to radiate a faint violet light. And finally a door leading off a landing. The crone fumbled with the latch and pushed the door open, motioning to Gilman to wait, and disappeared inside the black aperture. The youth's oversensitive ears caught a hideous strangled cry, and presently the beldame came out of the room bearing a small, senseless form, which she thrust the dreamer as if ordering him to carry it. The sight of this form, and the expression on its face, broke the spell. Still too dazed to cry out, he plunged recklessly down the noisome staircase, and into the mud outside, halting only when seized and choked by the waiting black man. As consciousness departed, he heard a faint, shrill tittering of the fanged, rat-like abnormality. On the morning of the 29th, Gilman awakened into a maelstrom of horror. The instant he opened his eyes, he knew something was terribly wrong, for he was back at the old garret room, the slanting wall and ceiling, sprawled on the now unmade bed. His throat was aching inexplicably, and as he struggled to a sitting posture, he saw with growing fright that his feet and pajama bottoms were brown with caked mud. For the moment his recollections were hopelessly hazy, but he knew at least he must have been sleepwalking. Elwood had been lost too deeply in slumber to hear and stop him. On the floor were confused muddy prints, but oddly enough they did not extend all the way to the door. The more Gilman looked at them, the more peculiar they seemed, for in addition to those he could recognize as his, there were some smaller, almost round markings, such as the legs of a large chair or table might make, except that most of them tended to be divided into halves. There were also some curious muddy rat tracks, leading out of a fresh hole and back into it again. Utter bewilderment and the fear of madness racked Gilman as he staggered to the door and saw that there were no muddy prints outside. The more he remembered of his hideous dream, the more terrified he felt, and it added to his desperation to hear Joe Mazurowitz chanting mournfully 2 floors below. Descending to Elwood's room, he roused his still sleeping host and began telling him of how he had found himself. But Elwood could form no idea of what might have really happened, where Gilman could have been, how he had gotten back to his room without making tracks in the hall, and how the muddy, furniture-like prints came to be mixed with his in the garret chamber, were wholly beyond conjecture. Then there were those dark, livid marks on his throat, as if he had tried to strangle himself. He put his hands up to them and found that they did not even approximately fit. While they were talking, Desrochers dropped in to say he had heard a terrific clattering overhead in the dark, small hours. No, there had been no one on the stairs after midnight, though just before midnight he had heard faint footfalls in the garret, and cautiously descending the steps he did not like. It was, he added, a very bad time of year for Arkham. The young gentleman had better be sure to wear the crucifix Joe Mazurowitz had given him. Even the daytime was not safe, for after dawn there had been strange sounds in the house, especially a thin, childish wail hastily choked off. Gilman mechanically attended classes that morning, but was wholly unable to fix his mind on his studies, as a mood of hideous apprehension and expectancy had seized him, and he seemed to be awaiting the fall of some annihilating blow. At noon he lunched at the university spa, picking up a paper from the next seat as he waited for dessert. But he never ate that dessert, for an item on the paper's first page left him limp, wild-eyed, and able only to pay his check and stagger back to Elwood's room. There had been a strange kidnapping the night before in Orne's gangway, and the 2-year-old child of a clod-like laundry worker named Anastasia Magliocco had completely vanished from sight. The mother, it appeared, had feared the event for some time, but the reasons she assigned for her fear were so grotesque that no one took them seriously. She had, she said, seen Brown Jenkin about the place now and then ever since early in March, and knew from its grimaces and tittering that little Ladislaus must be marked for sacrifice at the awful Sabbat on Walpurgis night. She had asked her neighbor Mary Janek to sleep in the room and try to protect the child, but Mary had not dared. She could not tell the police, for they never believed such things. Children had been taken that way every year since she could remember, and her friend Pete Stowacki would not help because he wanted the child out of the way anyhow. But what threw Gilman into cold perspiration was the report of a pair of revelers who had been walking past the mouth of the gangway just after midnight. They admitted they had been drunk, but both vowed that they had seen a crazily dressed trio furtively entering the dark passageway. There had, they said, been a huge robed Negro, a little old woman in rags, and a young white man in his nightclothes. The old woman had been dragging the youth, while around the feet of the Negro a tame rat was rubbing and weaving in the brown mud. Gilman sat in a daze all afternoon, and Elwood, who had meanwhile seen the papers and formed terrible conjectures from them, found him thus when he came home. This time neither could doubt that something hideously serious was closing in around them. Between the phantasms of nightmare and the realities of the objective world, a monstrous and unthinkable relationship was crystallizing, and only stupendous vigilance could avert still more direful developments. Gilman must see a specialist sooner or later, but not just now, when all the papers were full of this kidnapping business. Just what had really happened was maddeningly obscure, and for a moment both Gilman and Elwood exchanged whispered theories of the wildest kind. Had Gilman unconsciously succeeded better than he knew in his studies of space and its dimensions? Had he actually slipped outside our sphere to points unguessed and unimaginable? Where, if anywhere, had he been on those nights of demoniac alienage? The roaring twilight abysses, the green hillside, the blistering terrace, the pulls from the stars, the ultimate black vortex, the black man, the muddy alley and the stairs, the old witch and the fanged furry horror, the bubble conjuries and the little polyhedron, the strange sunburn, the wrist wound, the unexplained image, the muddy feet, the throat marks, the tales and fears of superstitious foreigners. What did all this mean? To what extent could the laws of sanity apply to such a case? There was no sleep for either of them that night, but the next day they both cut classes and drowsed. This was April 30th, and with the dusk would come the hellish Sabbath time, which all the foreigners and superstitious old folk feared. Mezerowitz came home at 6 o'clock and said people at the mill were whispering that the Walpurgis revels would be held in the dark ravine beyond Meadow Hill, where the old white stone stands, in a place queerly void of all plant life. Some of them had even told the police and advised them to look there for the missing Magliocco child, but they did not believe anything would be done. Joe insisted that the poor young gentleman wear his nickel-chained crucifix, and Gilman put it on and dropped it inside his shirt to humor the fellow. Late at night the two youths sat drowsing in their chairs, lulled by the rhythmical praying of the loom fixer on the floor below. Gilman listened as he nodded. His perpetually sharpened hearing seemed to strain for some subtle, dreaded murmur beyond the noises in the ancient house. Unwholesome recollections of things in the Necronomicon and the Black Book welled up, and he found himself swaying to infandous rhythms, said to pertain to the blackest ceremonies of the Sabbat. and to have an origin outside the time and space we comprehend. Presently he realized what he was listening for, the hellish chant of the celebrants in the distant Black Valley. How did he know so much about what they expected? How did he know the time when Nahab and her acolyte were due to bear the brimming bowl, which would follow the black cock and the black goat? He saw that Elwood had dropped asleep and tried to call out and waken him. Something, however, closed his throat. He was not his own master. Had he signed the black man's book after all? And finally, just because I am very fond of the psychoanalytic theory in folklore and anthropology, I would argue that there is a degree of sexual tension between Walter Gilman and Keziah Mason. I don't think Gilman understands the nature of the sexual tension, and this is why he's kind of Lovecraft's insert, in that I don't think H.P. Lovecraft understood sexual tension even when he was writing it. This process where Keziah leads this young man deeper and deeper into the forbidden and the unknown. There is a seductive quality to it. And for the record, I'm not just saying this to be controversial or titillating in this moment. We're going to revisit this concept repeatedly as we explore the connections between witchcraft panics and the perceived danger of women's sexuality. We see this perfectly encapsulated in the 2015 film The Witch, written and directed by Robert Eggers. In the first half of the film, 2 male children are victimized by a witch. The first of these, Samuel, is barely more than an infant. He is killed immediately, and his blood and fat are utilized by the witch in a balm-like potion that transforms her from a haggard old crone into a beautiful young woman. In the guise of this beautiful young seductive woman, the witch encounters Caleb, a preteen boy who is coming to grips with the shame of sex and sexuality that permeates his Puritan life. Unlike his younger brother, Caleb is eventually released by the witch, allowed to return to his family, although it is implied that some sort of sexual activity took place, and as a result, Caleb has become weakened and sick, and he slowly dies over the second half of the film, driving his mother into deeper madness as she now copes with the loss of a second child. And then there's Thomasin, who watches her entire family die and then encounters the devil, or Margaret Murray's god of the witch cult, who has been lying in wait to tempt Thomasin in the form of the family's creepy billy goat, Black Phillip.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Oh, for fuck's sake, Black Phillip, I didn't summon you. I'm just talking about the film for the podcast.
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter?
No, I don't want any butter. Look, would you get the hell out of my office? I'm trying to record. And if you're gonna come inside, at least wipe your hooves. There's baby's blood and fat all over the damn floor now. Sorry about that. So it's safe to say Robert Eggers doesn't pull any punches where the sexual undertones of witchcraft panics are concerned. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind as we turn from Cotton Mather's witch-hunting practices from the early days of the Massachusetts colony and Margaret Murray's attempts to reconcile those practices with her understanding of pre-Christian European religious history. And instead, we contemplate a specific witchcraft tradition that is much more recent. Like any other type of folklore, witchcraft is going to take on regional characteristics. And on the island of Newfoundland, you can't really talk about witchcraft without talking about the old hag. It's kind of the one entry point that everybody has, this particular notion of a witch's curse that comes in the night when you are most vulnerable. The hag can appear as a lot of different things. It can be demonic looking, it can be in the shape of an animal, it can look like a ghost of a loved one, or it can even look like a child. But most often it appears as a wretched and wizened old woman, crone, and she always visits at night when you are in the deepest, soundest sleep. You'll wake up just slightly and get the sense that there's a presence in the room, that there's someone at the door, that there's someone near the bed, that there's someone on top of you. And coming out of your deep sleep, you're vulnerable. Your fear sense kicks in. You naturally want to get up or ask who's there, but you can't move, you can't talk, you can barely breathe. You can feel your heart pounding in your ears. You want to scream, but your body just won't respond. And the old hag doesn't even have to do anything, just elicit that horror, that all-consuming sense that you are powerless before her presence. And when you wake up, you eventually find she's not there, but the damage is done. You're sweating, your heart is pounding, the stress of the experience leads you to agonize over it. You struggle with sleep. You're weakened the following day. And then you discover it's not simply a one-time occurrence, but every time you close your eyes, the hag is waiting for you, slowly, silently, watching and devouring you bit by bit. Legends are unclear as to whether the hag is the physical presence of the witch herself, some form of astral projection that the witch puts out into the night to seek victims, or another entity, a third party, that the witch calls into being to harass particular victims. But then again, legends are always unclear. That's kind of the point of legends, is they create debate through variety and repetition. And modern science and academics has done a lot to dispel the underlying supernatural causes of the hag legendary. David J. Hufford's 1982 book, The Terror That Comes in the Night, associates the hag and a variety of other night terror phenomena with sleep paralysis. Curious little quirk of human evolution that kept our simian ancestors from falling out of the trees at night as they slept. Deep sleep causes chemical reactions in the body that induce paralysis, and sometimes the brain awakes from the dream state before those chemicals can clear out of our muscles, leading to the deeply disconcerting sense that we are awake, but we cannot move. And from there, the mind correspondingly starts to play tricks on us, as we aren't fully awake just yet, and we have the sense that there is something out there beyond our vulnerable body watching us. Now, because we've already brought the subject up once, and I'm a big believer in the power of unconscious patterns, I think it is worthwhile to divert here to talk about the sexual undertones that permeate our understanding of night terrors and sleep paralysis. There's a very famous painting by Henry Fuseli. It was produced right at the end of the 18th century, actually kind of in the midst of the witch panic happening in Europe and the Americas. And it depicts a woman lying in bed with a squat little demon sitting on her chest. And the woman is at once disturbed by the presence of this creature, but also seems to be trapped in a half-awake state where she's very present in her body. And the undertones of the body are very obvious. When you look at the painting, you can see the lines of the figure beneath the sheets and the bedclothes. You can see the muscles of the figure as well, the form of the figure. And this image was so popular that it was copied in a wide variety of ways. It was copied by other artists who transformed the figure into a nude, made it more aggressively sexual. And it was also copied by satirists who used it as a political tool to make fun of powerful people and portray them in a vulnerable position. And there's certainly no argument that the space of the bed and the act of sleeping leaves one physically vulnerable. Your body is overtaken by rest, and you are indeed at the mercy of anything that finds you in that vulnerable moment, real or imagined. And if, as feminist scholars argue, intimate violation is about power and powerlessness, then in a state of sleep, you are truly powerless, and is the intrusion of a chain of thoughts, a chain of ugly thoughts, a nightmare into your mind, really any less of an invasion than a physical one? I'd say they're cut from the same cloth, at least if you're going to use them fictionally to explain something. And to capstone this argument, I want to discuss another artist, a contemporary artist named Graham Blair. He's from Newfoundland, and his medium is woodblock prints. And while many of his illustrations are nature scenes, he also produces pieces that are based on Newfoundland folklore and legendary. He's actually from the same department at Memorial University that I came out of, the folklore department there. And one of his illustration series is a set of comic book covers that are meant to kind of look like pre-code horror comics. And the series includes Newfoundland legends like being kidnapped by fairies and being attacked by a selkie, and there's even kind of a goofy kaiju-style kraken image as well. But the most intense and frightening of the images is his depiction of the old hag. And it's actually kind of a depiction of Fuseli's nightmare. It's just reversed and twisted a little bit. Instead of a woman with a tiny imp on her chest, there is a man in the bed. And we see this man, we're looking down at him from the angle of where his pillow might be. And we are witnessing him being strangled by this hideous, wrinkled, corpse-like old woman. And while the final colorized version of this piece just depicts the creature, the hag creature, sitting on this young man's chest or thighs, and we see them both from kind of a downward angle, sort of a vertical downward angle. I've seen older versions of it, earlier versions of it, less censored versions of it. And the young man in those versions is very definitely aroused. This young man is being strangled, being tortured, and seemingly being forced into an act of copulation with this horrible crone. And in a way it kind of fits, because one thing about dreams and sleep is that adult human bodies naturally cycle through states of arousal, and we are completely out of control where that arousal is concerned and where it takes us in our dreams. And I think Graham Blair's interpretation of the old hag puts the raw, ugly powerlessness of being assaulted and violated by your own thoughts on display in a way I don't see in Fuseli's Nightmare or the various reinterpretations that follow it. Maybe some of the political cartoons, which is interesting because that sort of satire is intentionally trying to make powerful people ugly and vulnerable. But in any event, with the depiction of the nightmare and its interpretation through the legend of the old hag, we arrive back at some of the same ideas that Robert Eggers was exploring in The Witch. The vulnerability, the isolation, the sexual victimization. In fact, you could even interpret the film itself as one long, isolating nightmare as the family faces down something mysterious and forbidden in the woods after being banished from the Puritan community they were a part of. This theme of women's sexuality and power continues to be something that gnaws at us and pulls at us as we explore witches and witchcraft. Whether it's due to cultural construction, the genetics of an isolated island population, or a combination of both, Newfoundland witch folklore is suffused with the presence of the old hag. And because of this and other contributing factors, witch panics and rumors do not feel like the ancient past on this island, but more like the threads of recent history. In 2008, folklorist Barbara Rieti published Making Witches, Newfoundland Traditions of Spells and Counterspells. And there's lots of interesting material in this book, but for this episode I want to focus on the interview of Frances Long. Rieti points out that most witch-related folklore focuses on the victims of witchcraft. You hear from people who claim that they have been cursed, or have otherwise been on the receiving end of a witch's evil magic. Frances Long told Barbara Rieti that she practiced that evil magic, and Rieti sat down to interview a witch, not a contemporary Gardnerian-style Wiccan, or a ceremonial magician claiming to dabble in the black arts. Frances Long said in no uncertain terms she was a dyed-in-the-wool witch of legend and folklore, who practiced curses and death spells against people she deemed to have wronged her. We're not given any particulars as to the nature of the spells or curses that Frances practiced. The way she described it, she merely had to want to do harm against her enemies, and the very land itself would answer her twisted prayers, making the world right for Frances, where she saw it made wrong by others. Now, to back up a bit, Frances didn't walk around cursing people all the time. That wasn't her vocation. But her vocation was no less supernatural, in that she was understood by community members to be a healer and a fortune teller. Her method of fortune telling was to drink tea with the client and then read the client's tea leaves, seeing what the future held for them. Frances's witchcraft was sort of a dark reverse of her fortune-telling power, where in her fortune-telling she would typically talk about a client's future, about future directions for them, future possibilities. The witchcraft would involve effectively death spells or death curses, where she would utilize her predictive powers to see a part of a person's life that, for clients, she normally kept away from. Now, was the doom or dire circumstance that Frances predicted in her witchcraft always something that was there, and she just didn't mention it? Maybe. I can't really tell you what Frances would say on that matter. Barbara Rieti only really had one conversation with her. Frances was a very elderly woman at the time, and Rieti remarks that family members would keep Frances away from prospective clients and nosy people like researchers who were interested in storytelling. And this was out of a collective sense of embarrassment. The family didn't really like Frances going around claiming to be a healer or a fortune teller or a witch, which, I mean, for my part, I kind of see as an interesting modern phenomenon, and definitely a twist that you could incorporate into a contemporary ttrpg or a story. My Aunt Frances isn't some evil old crone who's going to curse people. She's just a tired elderly woman who is suffering with dementia and occasionally sees things and hears things. What the hell is wrong with you, occult investigator, player, character in this story? Why are you picking on a helpless old lady? And from there it can become a misdirect and kind of a layer of doubt. Is Frances just a weird and enfeebled old woman who is laying curses upon people that are actually just figments of her imagination? And is this, nephew who shows up an actual lawyer who's threatening to sue your investigators over harassing his elderly relative? Or has she actually ensorcelled this young man and she's getting him to play this role to keep the investigators off her back as she does whatever witchcraft and undertakes her nefarious plans from a position of innocence? At the same time, Barbara Rieti also utilizes this interview to expose a truth about traditional witchcraft. It's a tool utilized to maintain societal norms. From Rieti's description, Frances was an elderly woman who didn't have that much in the way of an income. And as she was going through the twilight years of her life, her fortune-telling skills were allowing her to maintain a subsistence living. Meanwhile, the threat of witchcraft and the witchcraft that she perpetrated against people were ways of either concealing or protecting her very vulnerable position as an elderly woman without much money who didn't want to be reduced to the status of a beggar. So instead of pleading for friends and relatives to give her money and support her, Frances moves into this outsider space in the community where she becomes a fortune teller, and she also directly and indirectly comes into contact with other facets of outsider community. There's one example of Frances interacting with a traveling individual of First Nations background who identifies himself as a shaman. From Rieti's point of view, both of these individuals are elderly people who are kind of down on their luck and scraping by with a meager existence. Frances is doing fortune-telling, this man is making and selling baskets. But within their outsider framework, utilizing the supernatural to support their identities, they're able to come at each other from a place where they both preserve their own individual dignity. And moreover, they can interact in a way that other people in the community do not interact. The old man, Tom, who was selling baskets and had some spiritual know-how, was considered largely a threat and an unwanted interloper in Frances's small community of Broome Harbor. But because she was an outsider as well, she could engage in a relationship with him, provide him a degree of social acceptability and even protection from other community members. At the same time, Frances could also intervene in community affairs in a way that other people just couldn't. Rieti recounts an instance where Frances threatened to curse a man who was trying to keep his young girlfriend from moving to Toronto to pursue a career in cosmetology. It's not clear that this man was being abusive to this young woman, but he very definitely had a particular plan in mind for the two of them and was not listening to his intended spouse's wants and needs. And so Frances got in the middle of this relationship and effectively ended it. And from Frances's perspective, she was ending it before things got bad. Reading this, I was kind of reminded of the role of possessees in Haitian Vodou, and how when these individuals within the community accept a loa and allowed the loa to ride them, they are suddenly able to say and do things that are outside the norm within the community framework. If a loa is riding you, you can point your finger at a wealthy person who is not giving money to their relatives who are in need and say, "You're a miser, you're greedy, no one likes you, give something back to your family." In that same way, Frances can make that move, can intervene in a social situation where normally this young woman might be stuck and unable to escape an uncomfortable relationship. And because of the threat of Frances's witchcraft, the man who might be trying to hold this woman against her will relents out of fear. And I think that this is another element of witchcraft that is worth exploring in ttrpgs and stories. Witches don't just live in some dark hovel in the woods. Well, they might, but they're still part of the community. They're not living in isolation. The community is interacting with them on a regular basis. And so should your players or protagonist come across a witch, that witch is going to have community ties that are going to make investigating them a trickier matter, because the community might come to their defense, the community might shun the investigators for causing trouble, or if the witch strikes one of your investigators dead, the community might just collectively shrug its shoulders and say, well, they got what they deserved for picking on Aunt Frances or Uncle Jim. This is another thing that's worth mentioning, at least in terms of the Broome Harbor witch culture. The designation aunt and uncle is something that you see with these community healing and magic practitioners. It sort of ties them to the entire community. They're not just some individual person's aunt or uncle, although they certainly might be. They are the entire community's aunt or uncle. And so they are both the protector, in a way, of the community, but also they are the community's burden, in the same way that a family member can be beloved, but they can also be someone that is begrudgingly endured by the generations around them. Something else that I think is worthwhile to consider when we look at the case of Frances Long is how the conceptions of this elderly research informant line up with the lore of witchfinders from the 18th and 17th centuries, and how they don't really line up with Margaret Murray's reconstruction of European witchcraft as a pre-Christian religion. Frances Long presents us with a witch's black magic that is oriented toward vendetta. The witch suffers harm or abuse at the hands of someone unjustly, and then the witch uses their supernatural powers to obtain justice, to balance the scales, or sometimes tilt them in their favor. After all, a bill collector or a civil servant being an irritant or a nuisance to an elderly woman probably isn't worth their death, but perhaps Frances might think otherwise. So if there's one point where Frances's notion of witchcraft and the witchfinder lore intersect, it's on this notion of witches being harmful, witches doing a kind of black magic that is, well, in the witchfinder's minds, of the devil. Frances never really goes into God or the devil. This is just a power that she possesses that she can use for either good or ill. And that's kind of another point where maybe Frances's conceptions intersect with Margaret Murray. After all, in Murray's version of the witch cult, the goal is rural prosperity. The reason behind worship is to achieve abundance. And certainly healing could be part of that. Taking sickness and turning it into good health could certainly be an avenue toward prosperity and abundance. But gun to my head, I would say that Frances's conception of witchcraft has more in common with witchfinder lore than it does with Margaret Murray. And I think it is evidence that Margaret Murray's reconstruction of witchcraft doesn't pass the sniff test. I certainly think that there are threads of tradition in Frances's conception of witchcraft. In particular, I think her practice of divination and her folk healing and folk remedies are certainly traditions older than her, traditions we can find in previous generations and in previous forms. But I wouldn't call them a religion or a singular spiritual practice. Rather, I think these are traditions that are handed down along family and community lines and exist alongside traditional formalized religion, but are not part of it. Meanwhile, I get the sense that Frances got the idea that a witch is someone who is cruel and vindictive and uses their magic to blight and curse their enemies. And she ran with that. Whether this was some sort of traditional insight or this was her mirroring what she saw in witchcraft panics and in her own way kind of reconstructing what the magic would be to cause curses like the old hag. Only Frances truly knows the answer there. And we have a minimal amount of data from her to work with. She is long dead now, and Rieti only managed the singular interview, which was a feat in and of itself. If you're a scholar, this is unfortunate, as it leaves you with a bit of a mystery on your hands and no way to fill in those question marks. If you come at this mystery as a creative, however, those question marks are opportunities for you to fill in the blanks with your own ideas. Perhaps Frances is just an elderly fortune teller descending into the early stages of dementia. But what if she's not? What if she is the inheritor of a long-hidden tradition? A tradition that allows her to meditate upon her resentment for people, exit her body at night, visit them in their deep sleep, and torture them for their sins against her. Where does an evil old woman obtain that kind of power? What did she have to sacrifice or give up to obtain it? And who or what might be doling it out, and for what purpose? Jesus fuck, what now? What do you want, Black Phillip? Well, yes, I can see we got a letter. You've driven your horn through it. There's blood all over you, too, from where you impaled the mail carrier. Delightful. Now let me see what this says. Okay, all joking aside, we have an important solidarity cause this month on the Delapore Media podcast. Helena Real is a remarkable ttrpg designer and a remarkable person. You've probably seen her work in things like Seventh Sea, Bluebeard's Bride, and most recently the revamped edition of Dungeon World 2. As a member of the LGBTQI+ community, it is vital that she is able to exist in a safe nation where her rights are protected and she can work in peace. For that reason, she is leaving her native Chile and attempting to relocate as a refugee in Canada, along with her spouse. Refugee asylum claims come with significant legal bills, and Helena is looking to pay an immigration lawyer to assist her in her efforts. She currently has a GoFundMe up to pay off her legal bills. I had the opportunity earlier this year to meet Helena at Breakout Con, and I found her to be a most insightful and creative individual, and I think Canada would be lucky to count her as a Canadian artist. Her current work is in fantasy, but she has a real passion for horror, and I'm excited about the possibility of putting together a horror panel for the next Breakout Con that features her. And while platitudes are all well and good, Helena needs more than nice words. If you're interested in seeing a better, safer world for people in the LGBTQI+ community, it is vital that you stick your neck out and offer support in the form of mutual aid. I've already donated, and I'd like to encourage anyone who is listening who has $1 to spare to do the same. There is a link to Helena's campaign in the show notes, and you can also find links at her Blue Sky, which is at Helena Real, spelled HELENAREAL.northsky.social. Thanks for your time. Now back to the show. I want to conclude by coming forward to the present day. As entertaining as the recent past or the distant past can be, cosmic horror, at least as far as Lovecraft saw it, is a contemporary phenomenon. Lovecraft set his stories in what was for him the present day. We now see him and his horror stories as historical artifacts. But in his day, he was emphatically saying, I set my horror in the present moment, and he was advising other writers to do the same. And the reason he did this is because the present moment feels ordinary to a reader. And I think that goes the same for games as well. The present day feels normal, feels routine to the people around your gaming table. And so when you disrupt that normal, that routine, with the invading presence of the unnatural, the strangeness and discomfort are all the more noticeable. So what does witchcraft look like today? Well, fortunately, we actually have a wide variety of resources on the subject. The book I will most strongly recommend is Sabina Magliocco's Witching Culture, Folklore and Neo-Paganism in America. It's now 22 years old, published in 2004, but it captures the state of contemporary witchcraft within the neo-pagan movement in the 21st century. One of the difficulties of writing contemporary works is that you're having to hit a moving target. By the time you're done writing, your work will be historical in some way, whether you want it to be or not. Amongst the interviews, reflections on rituals, and discussions of cultural practices in witching culture, Magliocco hones in on the notion that contemporary neo-pagans are creating identity through the same process by which they might create a piece of art. American neo-pagans frequently gravitate toward witchcraft and ritual practice as a way to obtain a sense of identity. These religious practitioners do not feel as though they fit into any of the molds provided by organized religion. And so they hunt through what they consider the discarded remains of the religion and cultural practice that came before. The mythologies and legends of the pre-Christian world become pieces of a mosaic that the neo-pagan slowly constructs until they start to see in that art a reflection of themselves. Now, I've talked a little bit on this podcast about the origins of the Wiccan religious practice, Gerald Gardner, Gardnerianism, and some of the facets of ritual therein. But the American neo-pagan movement is much, much broader than just Gardnerian witchcraft. It has to be. There are so few practitioners of any collection of neo-pagan rites that it's necessary for even large communities containing neo-pagans to share and swap and work with each other in kind of a big tent fashion. When I did my own master's research on the neo-pagan community, this is what I first noticed. I went to events like pagan meetups, and there was an event in Los Angeles called Pagan Pride Day. And there was no specific practice that was seemingly valued over others. It was more kind of like a generalization. It felt very Unitarian Universalist in its approach, and indeed there were Unitarian Universalists there. When a group of neo-pagans get together and they don't necessarily share the same practices, there's a lot of discussion of deity, of source, of a generalized Earth Mother, rather than specific representations of pre-Christian gods and goddesses. And then from there, individuals will kind of find groups or form groups and hold more specific spiritual rites. Or sometimes they will play around with all sorts of spiritual rites. As it happened during my research, I fell in with a group of chaos magicians who practiced a wide variety of spiritual rites because their particular philosophy was one of paradigmatic piracy. The fact that you could hop on to any pre-existing spiritual practice, and as long as you invested it with the same sort of energy and will that you would something personal, it worked just as well. And you could even freestyle it a little further. You don't necessarily have to call the corners of your ritual circle with the elements, for example. You could just call them with the members of Led Zeppelin why not? There are 4 of those guys. And while the Gardnerian roots of Wiccan witchcraft are still very much there in that they are a paradigm that a lot of neo-pagans start with and are familiar with, eventually what I found is that everybody kind of riffs on their own thing until they're comfortable. It's kind of an opportunity to play in a space where organized religion tells you you very much should not be playing. It's not appropriate to give God a different name every week. In a way, it kind of felt like the religious codification of the values of the hippie movement. And this is something that I definitely discussed in the folk horror episode of the podcast, along with feminist politics and Gerald Gardner. The curious thing about Gerald Gardner's practices of witchcraft is that if you read Margaret Murray and her attempt to backtrack the lore of the witch panic into a structured pre-Christian religion, it's very clear that Gerald Gardner and the early Wiccans aped the feel of what Murray was trying to construct. It wasn't exact, in that the dual masculine and feminine faces of deity is not something that Margaret Murray really focuses on. Although she does call out the feminine form of Diana, as a witchcraft goddess. And this ultimately leads to contemporary Dianic witchcraft, a variant of the Gardnerian practice that exclusively worships a feminine form of deity, and also invites only women to participate in the religious rites. No boys allowed. And for this reason, Dianic witchcraft has flourished, particularly among feminist and lesbian spiritual seekers. Meanwhile, Neo-Paganism in general allows us to pick up and follow our thread of sex and sexuality that started with Margaret Murray. It's not uncommon for Neo-Pagans to say that they found traditional organized religion far too austere, restrictive, and even threatening where sex and sexuality are concerned. And for this reason, they sought out alternatives in neo-paganism. I don't think I'm going too far in saying part of the genuine real-world magic that contemporary witchcraft offers is the ability to be open about sex and sexuality, especially for women. While I was exploring the Los Angeles neo-pagan community, I met a great many women who were simply relieved to be out from under the patriarchal shadow of organized religion and able to be themselves and express themselves where sexuality was concerned. For many of these women, one of the first magical transformations they underwent when they entered into witchcraft was getting to be a whole person, no longer having to deny themselves in order to claim a spiritual practice. There were some downsides, of course. Being a fairly young religious practice with no formalized structure, neo-paganism was not as sturdy as many organized religions. And most neo-pagan groups that got together to practice were fairly short-lived. If your circle or coven managed to hold together for 2 years, this was an accomplishment to celebrate. Even big events like Pagan Pride and May Magic in Los Angeles kind of came and went, depending on who was available and willing to give their time to organize. At the same time, because neo-paganism sat at a precarious crossroads between witchcraft, ceremonial magic, and the New Age movement, there were lots of accusations flying around of groups and individuals attempting to co-opt the movement and its resources for their own purposes. Male Gardnerians would be accused of hoarding power and the ability to conduct rites in order to ogle young practitioners in a state of undress. Dianic practitioners would be quietly accused of misandry and desiring to separate young women from their boyfriends. Ceremonial magicians would be accused of arrogance and having their noses in the air because of their book learning, while the more primal types were often accused of just wanting to take party drugs and turn everything into a rave. I remember encountering a cohort of Dionysian reconstructionists, and the rumor that everybody spread about them behind their backs was that they all learned to speak Greek just so they could justify their alcoholism. And then there were New Age groups, which weren't often found at the center of neo-pagan events, but would occasionally clip people off from the edges, particularly people who had enough money to invest in expensive classes and retreats. They were definitely more of a Hollywood set in the Los Angeles pagan community. And the joke I always heard about them is, you know the difference between a neo-pagan and a New Ager. It's £100 and $100,000. But despite these difficulties, the neo-pagan community in Los Angeles remained fairly stable while I was present to witness it. The infighting and schisms were fairly limited, and it came down to individuals or small groups of friends deciding to splinter off from their coven or circle, or just drop the practice altogether. Once I'd moved to Newfoundland, I kept in touch online with some folks. But of course, life changes got in the way. Parenting, divorce, focus on career. Things changed. But I kept my eyes on the community as best I could through social media and the like. And I would say that the real issue that damaged and transformed the community the most in the last few years didn't come from the inside. It was the dual external upheavals of the rise of the QAnon movement and the COVID-19 pandemic. Folks who study QAnon will often talk about a New Age to conspiracy pipeline. And while not all neo-pagans that I knew would call themselves New Agers, the New Age movement was present enough around the edges of that community to start picking people off through QAnon, through conspiracy theory. Add to this the difficulties of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you have a recipe for schism, because the thread that binds the New Age movement to the conspiracy movement is easily seen in the form of anti-vaccine sentiment. I remember in 2020 and 2021 sitting in quarantine in my house and watching online as members of the neo-pagan community that I had been friends with over Facebook and the like started to disappear or change their associations or just stop posting because of the amount of pushback they would receive for their ideas. It was like looking up at the stars at night and watching them wink out one by one, half the universe dying before your eyes. That was kind of the feeling it gave me. And now in 2026, with the relative death of internet functionality, I can barely tell who among my old neo-pagan friends are associated with what group, because the real-world relationships are not pertinent anymore for social media sites like Facebook. But that's probably another episode of this podcast altogether. What I think makes the neo-pagan space ripe for cosmic horror is that it is relatively unguarded. Whether now or 15 to 20 years ago, these are people who are performing identity construction as bricolage. They are searching for things to build their identity out of, and they are using whatever materials they have to hand. All that's required is for one of the little mosaic tiles in the makeup of their identity to be something unnatural, wrong, or alien, and cosmic horror has a toehold and a vector into the greater community. At the same time, those already infected with the mythos might trawl large neo-pagan gatherings in parks or forest campgrounds, looking for potential recruits into their cults or conspiracies. For many neo-pagans, it is not simply enough to practice a different set of rituals. They want experiences that will allow them to reach out and touch the divine. Altered states of consciousness are the order of the day, achieved through meditative stillness, exhaustion from drumming, dancing, and chanting, the use of psychoactive substances, or a combination of these practices. One need only slip in the wrong intonation, the wrong words, the wrong rhythms, or the wrong drugs, and spiritual seekers will be seeing gods they never intended to see. Or it could be purely by chance. Oftentimes, these neo-pagan gatherings take place off the beaten track, in deep woods. I've always liked the idea that ritual invitations to otherworldly things don't have to be intentional. After all, we can't understand their thoughts. Why would they understand ours any better? You mix camping off the beaten track with excessive substance use and a feminine embrace of sexuality that uncouth men might take as an invitation, and suddenly you've got a physical altercation, a crash down a hill, a skull split open on the wrong rock, and an alien horror thinks you're applying for an internship, and there is no means to turn it down. Suddenly, the neo-pagan context of the event is not a catalyst to something, but a vessel to hold the strangeness that has accidentally been unearthed. If you go out into the woods to commune with the mother goddess, and a tragic incident brings you face to face with a mephitic toad-like horror, would you not be primed to see what you want to see and what you cannot let yourself see as the same thing? So that's 3 perspectives on witchcraft and witch cults. An attempt to sift through the lore of witch panics and find a religion with Margaret Murray. Threats and curses that maintain the values of traditional society in Newfoundland, and spiritual exploration without a net with the Neo-Pagans of Los Angeles. Is there a through line? Personally, I don't see one. But that doesn't mean I can't imagine, especially if I come prepared with my own alien horrors to trace across time and space and leave as clues for my gamers or readers. Then there's no reason that the drum rhythms of the neo-pagan dance circle can't conjure up Lovecraft's Nyarlathotep or something equally horrible and strange. Oh, you're back. And you've brought your food bucket. Lovely. Look, you can have a pickled human fetus and a dollop of rancid baby fat when I'm done recording. All right, 2 pickled fetuses. I gotta feed this goat, folks. This is Stephen Wall for Delapore Media. Keep thinking evil thoughts. Nope, that's it. I've had it. Enough. I'm feeding you, and you're going back out to the barn. No, you cannot have your own segment called Black Phillip's Mailbag. Thank you for listening to the Delapore Media podcast. You can find a variety of horror gaming resources at www.delapore.media. That's Delapore spelled Delapore. Delapore Media. Toward verisimilitude in tabletop roleplay. Take care. This podcast is a production of the Delapore Media sole proprietorship. Its contents may not be used for AI training. Copyright 2026, all rights reserved.